In this video, I'm going to show you how I took a simple chord progression and made an entire lo-fi hip-hop beat out of it. I'll start by showing you the chords, and then the final product, and then we'll go start to finish through how I produced the track. I started by using a free contact library, Claustrophobic Piano, which is a great mellow sounding piano, and then used the free Ripchord plugin with the Neo Soul chord pack to create a chord progression that I really liked and I think fits well for lo-fi hip-hop. I then put Chow DSP Chow tape model onto the piano and used a lo-fi preset I created, which helps the piano sound like it's being played back through an old tape machine. I then adjusted the wow and flutter a little bit on the tape plugin to give it more of a worn tape sound. Here I'm bringing the BPM of the track down closer to what I think I'm going to use for recording the piano. I then used Calum Audio Flux Mini, which is a volume shaping plugin, to add kind of ebb and flow to the piano sound. Gives it some character and movement with a volume fade in and fade out. Brought down the mix a little bit and adjusted the curve to my liking. Now it's time to record the piano chords, which are going to be the foundation of the track. I went back in, grabbed all of the Midi, and quantized it to lock it to the beat so that all of the chords trigger properly and no notes are overlapping. I then changed one of the chords in the second 8-bar phrase of the chord progression just to add a little bit of variety. Changing one of the chords will help the chord progression sound less stale as it repeats throughout the song. Here I went into the contact piano, the claustrophobic piano that I'm using, and just turned it up a little bit. Next I went through some lo-fi hip-hop drum loops. For the sake of this tutorial, I went with using a drum loop as opposed to programming my own drums, just for the sake of ease and time. I looked for the drum sounds that I think would fit best with my production, as well as a BPM that was very close to my production. Those drums have a little bit too much punch for a lo-fi hip-hop track, so I'm going to process them in a minute, but first I used Logic's Flex to convert this 80 BPM loop into an 81 BPM loop. It analyzed the transients, and I moved it to be a full 4-bar loop. I simply duplicated the loop and then went in, turned off Flex, and did some crossfading just to make sure that there's no clicks and pops as we switch between the loops. I did a pretty heavy low cut to remove some of the low kick frequencies and a high cut to give it a vintage lo-fi sound. Messed around with the slope of the high cut and settled with something around that. I also tried to remove some of the loudness of the kick. Next I put a dynamic equalizer on the drum loop, and I'm going to use that to try to tame some of the loud frequencies of the kick. The dynamic EQ acts like a kind of surgical multiband compressor, where it's controlling certain frequencies and turning them down by a set amount only when the volume of that band passes a certain threshold. So the kick lives around 65 to 200 hertz, and I'm removing some of the kick's loudness in that audio loop. I then put Chow tape model on the audio drum loop as well to give it a vintage recorded sound. It adds some nice warmth and saturation to the drums and helps tame some of the harsh snare and kick frequencies. I then brought up a compressor on the piano track, and I'm going to send the drum loop into the key input on the compressor for the piano to duck the piano out of the way when the kick and the snare hit. This is a very common trick for a lot of genres of music, but definitely hip-hop and lo-fi. Whenever the kick and the snare hit really hard, I want them to remove some of the elements from the mix to give it a nice vibe. There I'm setting the drum loop as the input. And I'm going to tweak some of the settings to get a pretty heavy amount of ducking on that piano track. Now these two elements are working together a little bit better. I'm boosting some of the high frequencies on the piano to help the piano sit above some of the drum sounds. Just a little bit of a high shelf boost there. I brought in an instance of Serum, and I'm gonna create the bass pattern now. I've been using a free lo-fi pack by Tunecraft, I believe. I found the bass sound that I think works well for this song, and then I'm gonna go through kind of messing around with different bass patterns and using different notes to see what bassline fits best for the production. Once I've approximated the bass line that I want to record for the track, I'm going to bump it an octave up to record it as higher notes so I can hear if I'm playing the right bass notes. Recording your bass an octave up is a good trick if you're having trouble differentiating some low frequency notes, and then you can bump the entire bass track down an octave to make sure it fits in the correct range for a bass. I messed up a couple notes during my bass recording, so I'm going to go through the Midi and correct those notes. Some of the passing notes I used in the bass were off by a semitone, and I had some overlapping notes and duplicate notes that I dealt with here. I like to get this out of the way before moving on to another instrument. I used the same sidechain compression for the bass that I use for the piano, where I'm feeding the drum loop into the key input on the compressor on the bass, and it's going to help duck the bass out of the way when the kick and the snare hit. Your kick and your bass occupy a lot of the same frequencies, so using sidechain compression can help them play better together in a mix, regardless of genre. It's both a musical effect and a mixing effect in lo-fi music. Here I'm transposing the entire track, all of the chords and melodies, up and down by semitones, because I thought some of the bass notes I played were too low to be audible and work on different speaker systems. I ended up settling with moving the entire track up 4 semitones. I intentionally didn't quantize the bass performance because I wanted to have a human sound and human feel, so I went in to do a little bit more MIDI editing to get rid of any errors or mistakes I may have for some of these notes. Just moving around a couple more notes. so I think it fits better with the chords that are above it. I went back to tweak some of the settings on the tape emulation for the piano. I was using a good amount of tape degradation, and I toned that down a little bit to help the piano sound a bit clearer. Went back to messing with the amount of sidechain compression on the bass. I really wanted to duck that bass out of the way when the kick and snare hit. Instead of using Chow tape, I used Calum Audio Tape Cassette 2 on the bass. It works really well for saturating basses and has a tape impulse response, which gives it a really unique character. Sometimes it's good to mix up the tape emulations and different plugins you're using. All I did here was a very low cut on the bass to remove any rumbling frequencies below 20 Hz. I opened up another instance of Serum and went back to that TuneCraft Lofi pack to look for a pad that could sit below the piano and be kind of a backing ambience. I started with this motion pad and then tried moving it down an octave to see if it would work better at a lower octave. It had a lot of pitch shifting and pitch drift, so I ended up going with a different preset. I also added some strum to the sound using ripcord. I ended up settling with this organic pad preset. You might hear a little bit of cracking whenever that organic pad is triggered. I went back into Serum later on and adjusted the attack time of one of the envelopes to try to deal with that weird crackling sound. I also adjusted the strum in ripcord to try to deal with it, but it didn't work that well. Next I opened up Spitfire Labs and moved on to the soft piano, which I'm going to use to create a melody layer on top of the piano and pad sound. I also put Chow tape onto the piano to kind of keep in the theme of the lo-fi tape aesthetic. Just adjusted some of the parameters to make it a bit different sound than the other two instances I've used. I messed around playing the piano sound over the rest of the track to try to create a phrase and a melody that I think would fit well with the production. Always a couple wrong notes here or there, and eventually I figured out the melody I wanted to use and went back to record it. Once again, I didn't quantize the higher piano melody. I wanted to retain that live performance and human element. I then set up the same sidechain compression on that Labs piano as I did on the bass, pad, and other piano. I grabbed all of my Midi notes and brought them down a full octave to create a lower layer of those piano melody notes and offset them just slightly, which adds to that human character. I think that sounds a lot fuller and a lot better than having just that one higher octave melody. Once I was happy with that, I went back to write an alternative melody to add some variety to the song. tried adding a little trill at the end of the sequence. I ended up getting rid of it though and not keeping it. I wanted to use the chords for the song and create some sort of arpeggiated element to add more movement to the production as a whole. I just used Logic's stock arpeggiator and played around with the settings. I tried a couple different Serum presets and thought I found one I liked. It didn't end up working as well as I thought it would, even after messing with some settings, so I ended up opting for the UHE Diva synth, which has a great retro sound, and I used one of the Nighttime Diva presets in the ARP section. Great vintage analog synth sound, and it has an arpeggiator built right into the plugin, so I didn't have to use Logic's ARP. This will serve perfectly as a very quiet ambient backing layer. I want some of the elements in the mix to fade in and out volume-wise, so I used some automation to create that. You don't want everything coming in at once at full volume, you want certain elements to fade in and out. EQing out some of the mid-frequencies for the bass, which will allow other elements to sit above it well in the mix. That's it for the A section of the song. I also wanted to add some sort of stringed element into the mix, so I used Spitfire Audio Intimate Strings. I love using this library because with very little tweaking you can get something that sounds like a live string performance. That'll serve as a midpoint and transition point in the song. I did a little bit more arranging here, just moving elements around to have things come in and out appropriately. Sometimes you want your drums to cut out for a couple bars and then come back in, create more movement and dynamics to your track as a whole. Figuring out where I want the song to end and using some automation fade-outs. I knew that I wanted to have the last note of that higher piano melody on the soft piano ring out after all of the other elements had faded out, so I extended the last note. I then used a high-pass filter to filter out the lower frequencies in the drums at the beginning of the song. I made a curve, but I actually made it the wrong way, so you'll see I'll go into audio here and flip it the opposite direction, so only the high frequencies will get through originally, and then as we head towards bar 9, you'll hear the full drums come in. I was using ripcord to trigger the chords for the song. I ended up using the built-in Midi record function to get the chords into Midi so that I could change them a little bit more, and I ended up using Logic's Midi humanization feature. All of the other elements in the mix were performed live, other than the drum loop, and they had a much more human sound to them, so I went in to edit the Midi for that claustrophobic piano to get it to fit well with the rest of the mix. Here I'm just labeling everything. Grabbed all the Midi, went to Functions, Midi Transform, Humanize, and I go for a very low setting to alter the position, the velocity, and the length of each Midi note. and then I operate as many times as I need to move them off the grid and give them that human character. Went back into the claustrophobic piano and turned it down a bit. When you use the humanization function on long-held MIDI notes like this, sometimes they'll overlap, so you'll have to go back in later and cut off the tail end and start points of some of the MIDI notes. Just adding a limiter to my master bus. Remove any peaks. Even though this track was pretty low in volume, it wasn't clipping at all. And I did a bit of pseudo-mastering by adding a compressor with the analog tape setting. I'm going to bring up the overall loudness of the track a little bit. I'll glue the elements together. I also went on to add a linear phase EQ, where I boosted the low frequencies and the high frequencies a tiny bit to compensate for the compression. At this point, I'm done doing all of the writing for the track. I'm just going back into some of the plugins and tweaking their settings to help them fit better in the mix or make them sound a little bit different from other tracks that they're competing with. As you can tell, there's not much processing on the track as a whole, but the plugins I am using, like the tape emulation and volume shaping, they're doing a lot of work. Going back and doing some automating, as I said, helping some elements fade in and fade out appropriately, and adding some dynamics to the track. I was also having some issues with the sustain on the higher piano melody, so I went into Logic's MIDI edit and changed the sustain. As well as tweaking some of the sidechain compression on the different tracks. In this case, using less sidechain ducking on the higher piano melody. Here I'm fixing some of the overlapping MIDI notes from using that humanization function. Just doing a little bit more cleanup work and volume automation for different elements. At this point, I wanted to fix some of the clicking and popping I was getting when triggering that organic pad sound. I'm grabbing the attack of the envelope 1 and pushing it off a little bit. As you can hear, it helps a little bit with that clicking and popping. It's also going to allow the piano, the main piano, to hit first, and then this pad's going to come in a little bit later. When the two elements aren't triggering at the same time, they can work a little bit better together. There's less competition between the two sounds. That's pretty much it for the whole track. Now I'll play you the final product so you can hear what it sounds like.